So Donald Trump has a long history of making natural disasters about himself. And today was no different. The former president traveled to Georgia today to survey the devastation left behind by Hurricane Helene. And once again, he could not help but inject politics into a tragedy.
The governor's doing a very good job. He's having a hard time getting the president on the phone. I guess they're not being responsive. The federal government is not being responsive, but they're having a very hard time getting the president on the phone.
Okay, but here's the problem with that claim from Governor Brian Kemp himself.
The president just called me yesterday afternoon. I missed him and called him right back. And he just said, hey, what do you need? And I told him, you know, we got what we need. We'll work through the federal process. He offered that if there's other things we need, just to call him directly, which I appreciate that.
Well, that's a little awkward, I have to say. And in another classic case of projection, Trump is baselessly claiming Democrats are denying aid to Republican parts of North Carolina, which is not happening at all, though that is exactly what his administration did to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria back in 2017. Now, meanwhile, Kamala Harris canceled a number of planned campaign stops to return to Washington and visit FEMA headquarters today, which, by the way, is what an actual president would do. Here's what she had to say after getting briefed on the federal response.
Over the past 24 hours, I have spoken with Governor Kemp of Georgia, Governor Cooper of North Carolina, and many local officials. I have shared with them that we will do everything in our power to help communities respond and recover. And I've shared with them that I plan to be on the ground as soon as possible, but as soon as possible without disrupting any emergency response operations, because that must be the highest priority in the first order of business.
I'm back with the panel here, George, Ashley, Adrian, and Eugene. Okay, there are questions that are hard to answer, but I'm still going to ask them. Ashley, Donald Trump just lies in ways that are easy to disprove. Why?
So
I don't even know I'm getting, but it's like time to Brian Kemp.
I mean, I will say the challenge for his opponents is that he does. He lies shamelessly, and sometimes if it's not a lie, it's a mistruth or misinformation, and he's been doing that since 2015. And he made the calculation, not incorrectly, that his voters would forgive that. Previous politicians we've covered, if I was to fact check, say, Mitt Romney lying, he would change what he was saying, not because he cared that I, Ashley Parker at the Washington Post, gave him 4 Pinocchios, although those long noses are daunting.
We don't like them.
But he would change because he felt he would pay a penalty with voters. And Donald Trump correctly realized with his voters, again, that's not all voters, that's not enough to get him to victory, but with his voters, shamelessness is his superpower, and there is no price. And it then becomes, and maybe Adrian can speak to this, a bit of asymmetrical warfare, because he lies and he says things that aren't true, and as you pointed out, they're easily disproven. But if Vice President Harris was to do that, there would be a much bigger penalty for her. And it's hard, it's a challenge to run against someone like that.
It's definitely a challenge. Okay, Adrian, I mean, we're obviously laying it out because people should know the facts here.
Yeah.
But as the campaign, Ashley's right. You're dealing with somebody who's lying constantly. You can't spend all your time fact checking. What do you do about a scenario like this?
Well, look, I think in 2016, that was a challenge because, again, as I said previously, we had never run against a candidate like Donald Trump before. And so we were spending a lot of time trying to, fact check him and making sure reporters knew that he told 75 lies per speech and then trying to push back on those lies. Now, fast forward 8 years later, I think we've gotten to the point where, number one, we know that him doing that, saying these blatant, crazy lies, is not going to gain any more independent swing voters. It's not like, the comments that you showed earlier, which I'm not going to repeat, again, about the vice president that were very derogatory and very demeaning and very untrue. It's not like those are, there's an independent voter who's going to see those comments and say, oh, great, I'm going to vote for him because he said that. So we know that. We know now that it is more important, especially when you are talking to voters at this very critical juncture of the election, to focus on the issues, to make sure that the American people understand what a Trump 2.0 would look like, dismantling the ACA, enacting a nationwide abortion ban. You've got to focus on that. And to your point about, Attorney General Holder and surrogates. I mean, surrogates can do a lot of the work. to push back on some of those things. But we are focused on drawing that contrast on the substantive
Let me
issues.
ask, because George, you know a lot of people who may not have been in the Democratic circles forever. I mean, I do think that the functioning of government in a hurricane response this is something that it has been, in a bipartisan way, has been handled well by Republican and Democratic presidents and less well by others. It should matter. Do you think it matters? Like, if you're the Harris campaign, should you spend time on this particular contrast?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, they are actually in charge, the Biden and Harris administration. They are in charge. And, if you don't look like you're paying attention, which has happened in the past with snowstorms in cities like Washington and New York. Hurricane Katrina, didn't work out so well for the Bush administration. You pay a huge penalty for it. But it's also, you have to do it because it's the right thing to do. And Donald Trump doesn't care about any of that. He only cares about whether a particular crisis can be used to manipulate manipulate the public. And that's why he's willing to tell lie after lie. I mean, he's a pathological liar. He doesn't have that shame gene that the rest of us have when we even make the slightest mistake, even accidentally. He's just going to say whatever pops into his mind that he wants people to believe at any given moment. And it's not even really that calculating, okay, because he's impulsive, which is why, Adrian's going to be talking about issues and Project 2025, but there's also a part of the Harris campaign, which I really love, is they're doing things to trigger him. And then he goes, he was on at a rally the other day. They said she laid a trap for me. There was no trap. I wasn't trapped. Right as he's diving right into the trap one more time.
We all saw the trap.
So, the contrast and the split screen is really, really important here. This guy is a complete crazed, lying lunatic. Okay, and here's Vice President Harris acting like President Harris, and that's what people should be looking at.
To George's point, you've traveled now with President Biden and leader, as Ashley has as well. When there is a federal response needed, when there are disasters, we only have about less than a minute left, but why does that matter as people are looking at this?
Because one, it's when you're talking about voters, right? If you want to be crass and talk about the actual voting part of this, the people on the ground are seeing it. So North Carolina, Georgia, both swing states, those people are going to vote at some point here, and they're going to vote for or against Donald Trump or Vice President Harris. But then you also have the rest of the country watching, right? And so you walking around the disaster zone, if Vice President Harris does make that trip, they're trying to figure that out because of the drain on resources. So walking around looking like you're in charge, going to FEMA or doing what Donald Trump is doing. It's not bringing in, like Adrian was saying, those new folks, but the people that are watching that really matter, those suburban voters, those independent voters, and some of those Republicans who are going to try to make this race what it is at the end of the day, those folks are watching and paying a lot of attention because it tells you what they'll do when they're president. There's no better way to do it than actually seeing them do it.
It actually can impact people's lives. Think about it that way. George, Ashley, Eugene, Adrian, thank you all so much for joining me.
J.D. Vance says not only do conservatives need to, in his words, wake up, but what they need to wake up to is the fact that most of American life and culture should be, in his words, ripped out like a tumor. Those are, again, his words, not mine. Watch.
Our leaders right now are so corrupt and so vile that if you assimilate into their culture, you're assimilating into like garbage liberal elite culture. You're not assimilating into traditional American culture. And so this is a tough pickle for me. I don't even know what the right answer is here, because you can't just teach these things. You can't teach that we live in a great country if the leaders are actively aligned against it. So almost the thing that you need to do, step one in the process, is to totally replace, like rip out like a tumor, the current American leadership class, and then reinstall some sense of American, political religion.
We need to rip it out like a tumor and then install political religion. The man who is interviewing J.D. Vance here gets very excited about this idea, and it leads, this is important here, it leads J.D. Vance to explain sort of influences on his thought, where he gets his ideas on subjects like this.
You said something that I would like to zero down on. How do we effectively, quote, rip out the disgusting leadership class?
Oh man, I mean, you know.
Because let me expand on that just a second, because and I'm going to give you a little cover here, because it's not just, I mean, obviously elections, that's one thing. Okay. But unfortunately, this evil leadership class has already taken over all of our institutions. Current pipeline is to turn them into those people that we just called evil and disgusting. How do we, aside from elections, how do we rip out this leadership class? So these institutions are corrupted and rotted to the core. This elite ideology is everywhere and in all the things. What other options do we have besides voting them out, which we're seeing is ineffectual?
Yeah. So again, this is like a tough question, but this is maybe the question that confronts us right now. You know, there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
Knowing chuckle there. There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things. This is Curtis Yarvin, who J.D. Vance is citing here as he is talking about the need to, seize the universities, use the government to destroy businesses who aren't right wing. Talking about needing to rip out the American system like a tumor. Here's the guy he is citing as his sort of the source of his thinking on these matters.
So I've reduced this very complicated problem to a simple 4-letter acronym, which is RAGE. And RAGE stands for Retire All Government Employees. Very, very, very simple. Now, the problem with this is, why have you never heard this before? Why has no one ever suggested, let's just get rid of this thing? You have a government in Washington. You're either for it or against it. What is a government? A government is just a corporation which owns a country. Nothing more, nothing less. It so happens that our sovereign corporation is very poorly managed. And there's a very simple way to replace that, which is what we do to all corporations that have failed. We simply delete them. We haven't been able to do that with our government for 200 years. So it's gotten a little bit stale.
We should delete the U.S. government because it's stale. It has been around for too long. We haven't been able to do that, meaning delete our government for 200 years, so it's gotten a bit stale. It's been around too long. So what would that entail, deleting the U.S. government?
The other thing about getting rid of your government is you can't just say, well, the limits of the government are the limits of the formal government. You have to say, well, what is the system actually? And it includes a lot of things that are called NGOs, things that are called universities, things that are funded by the state. It's a very, very large system, and it all needs to be destroyed. Fortunately, there's a lot of talented Americans who actually know how to run things and make things work and are generalists. And you can just get these people, put them in a position of responsibility, and have them do their thing. And finally, you need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia.
If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia. So the vice presidential candidates debate is tomorrow. Tim Walz, the Democratic candidate, has been a governor, is currently the governor of Minnesota. He's been a long-term congressman, high school teacher, football coach, a soldier for decades. J.D. Vance, the Republican candidate, is a different kind of cat, forgive me. Aside from a brief stint in the Marine Corps, where he served with a public affairs unit, he has spent his entire adult life working for or being financially supported by eccentric right-wing tech billionaires, specifically ones who have devoted themselves to the political teachings of this guy.
Finally, you need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing.
I have debated whether or not to talk about this on the show because I feel like it gives me the oogs. But I also feel like this is an important thing to know about the Republicans' vice presidential nominee. and what he has to offer and why he was brought onto the ticket despite his palpable lack of political skill or likability, his lack of any track record in politics whatsoever. And after he spent less than 2 years in the only public office he's ever held, which is a Senate seat that he only barely won thanks to one of those eccentric tech billionaires giving him the single largest Senate campaign donation in the history of this country. I mean, he comes wholly from this very, very obscure, eccentric, right-wing subculture of tech billionaires. And his relationship with this eccentric Silicon Valley pro-dictatorship philosophy has been pretty widely discussed in print. These are a whole bunch of articles that have discussed this at one level or another. It's been discussed in print, but I don't feel like it's widely understood by the country who is paying attention to this guy as a candidate. But this is where J.D. Vance's big ideas come from about where the country is heading for. Quote, Vance is friends with Curtis Yarvin, whom he openly cites as a political influence. Yarvin, the main political influence on all of the people who have supported J.D. Vance throughout his career, including paying to install him in the U.S. Senate. When J.D. Vance says stuff like, we're in a late Republican period, which is something he says all the time, he doesn't mean anything about the Republican Party. He means we're at the time right before the Roman Republic collapsed. And what happened after the Roman Republic collapsed? Well, a dictator, Caesar, came in, and wasn't that better? He talks about being in a late Republican period all the time. That's him channeling this guy, Yarvin. When Vance says universities are the enemy and they should be seized, he's not only channeling Elizabeth Dilling and Alan Zoll and all the weird far-right crusaders against the universities from the 30s and 40s. That would be troubling enough. He's also channeling this guy, Yarvin, who says that while we are firing all the government employees, we should do the same to the universities because they're all part of the bigger system that all needs to be destroyed. He says, quote, retire their employees and liquidate their assets. Universities in particular have lovely campuses, many of which are centrally located and should be quite attractive to developers. Meaning, let's put somebody in to be a, what does he call it? CEO, a national CEO, which he says is indistinguishable from a dictator. And then the dictator should take over all the universities and sell them off to developers. This is literally a pro-dictatorship, pro-monarchy philosophy that is not just about ending the U.S. system of government, deleting the U.S. government, but then using the power of a dictator to dismantle universities, dismantle businesses, to dismantle all of civil society, to instead install a whole new system controlled by the state that serves just the desires of the dear leader. Tomorrow at the debate, it is going to come up that J.D. Vance wants a national abortion ban. It's going to come up that he has told and continues to tell horrible lies about immigrants. It is going to come up that he has said his running mate was America's Hitler, his phrase, and cultural heroin, and that Trump's presidency was a failure. It's going to come up. His involvement in Project 2025 is going to come up. His proposal that people without children should be taxed more and should have their votes count less. It will all come up at tomorrow's debate. But what do you do with this stuff?
The thing that you need to do, step one in the process, is to totally replace, like rip out like a tumor, the current American leadership class.
Republicans, conservatives, we're still terrified of wielding power, of actually doing the job that the people sent us here to do.
Finally, you need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing.
We've got to get comfortable with wielding power.
There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia.
They're going to have to get over their dictator phobia. What do you do with this level of radicalism? Trying to take over in Washington right now, and trying to convince the far right that they've got to stop being afraid of wielding this kind of power this way. What do you do with this at the debate tomorrow, in the campaign in general? I don't know, but we got to do something with it. Watch this space.
But we begin tonight with an answer, at long last, to the question many in the political world have wondered over the last 8 years since Trump went from reality show host, failed casino magnate, and frequent WWE performer to presidential candidate, declaring he would make America great again, a phrase previously used by Nazi fans in the 1930s and Ronald Reagan in 1980. And having failed to make it all that great and getting fired by 81 million Americans for botching America's COVID response, vowing that he would make America great again. And that question is, when is it that Trump thinks America was great the first time? Was it the 1980s through the early 2000s when he was actually popular? The 50s when the most that many women could look forward to was a new vacuum cleaner? Maybe the red summer of 1917 feels like that would track. Nope. Got to go back a little further.
You know, our country in the 1890s was probably, Marcia, probably the wealthiest it ever was because it was a system of tariffs. And we had a president, you know, McKinley, right? You remember Mount McKinley, and then they changed the name. But one of those things, he was really a very good businessman, and he took in billions of dollars at the time, which today it's always trillions, but then it was billions and probably hundreds of millions. But we were a very wealthy country.
Ah, there we have it. The McKinley era, 1897 to 1901, when William McKinley, who was actually not a businessman, succeeded his former Union military commander, Rutherford B. Hayes, who led the Republican Party's abandonment of its anti-slavery heritage in favor of betraying the formerly enslaved in the 1877 compromise to remove Union troops from the South and make him president, when he bet it all on big business. After his military service, Bill McKinley returned to his native Ohio, got a law degree, ran for Congress, and in 1890 became the chair of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, the committee that determines the budget and spending. There he became the architect, and here's why old Donald loves him, of the McKinley tariffs, the highest tariffs ever in U.S. history. The idea behind the McKinley tariffs was to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. But keep in mind, this was a time when the U.S. was an emerging manufacturing economy where we pretty much built everything at home, not like today when we import everything from video game systems to TVs to beer, tequila, wine, and food, all of which would cost more if you slapped on tariffs. Probably just a coincidence, maybe, that the same year as McKinley's tariffs, the U.S. faced a massive wheat crop failure that meant importing foreign wheat didn't seem like a good look for tariffs. And 3 years later, in 1893, the U.S. sunk into a massive 5-year recession with 10% unemployment and massive bank failures. But I digress. McKinley's support for high tariffs got him something really useful in politics, a really rich sponsor, a coal, iron, and grocery magnate named Mark Alonzo Hanna, who bankrolled McKinley's political career, funding his successful run for Ohio governor in 1891, which he held until 1896, and then his run for president that year. McKinley's presidency wasn't just about tariffs. It was also about empire. After an explosion on a U.S. battleship called the Maine that was later found to be just a structural failure, not sabotage, the U.S. launched a war against Spain to take Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines out of their empire and put the latter three into ours. And McKinley launched an open-door trade policy with China, having updated his attitude from tariffs, tariffs, tariffs to something called reciprocity. You trade with us, we trade with you. After his VP died of a heart attack, McKinley ran for re-election in 1900 with a new running mate, Hanna referred to as that damned Teddy Roosevelt. His run ended in 1901, though, when sadly, McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist who shot him in the chest during the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, clearing the way for the progressive Roosevelt administration and the vast saving of public lands, which MAGA Republicans also hate. They want to drill, baby, drill on and sell those lands to billionaire developers. But what you need to know about this era that Donald Trump says is the time when America was great before he made it great again is not just remember the Maine or Mount McKinley, which, by the way, was renamed Denali under the Obama administration to restore its indigenous Alaskan name, which is probably why Trump is so sore about it. the 1890s happened to fall smack dab in the middle of the Gilded Age, which began in the 1870s and kept going through the turn of the century. It was a time of rapid industrialization and extreme wealth inequality, a time when the super rich got richer and richer because the U.S. had no income taxes, which would not be passed until 1909 and ratified in 1913 under Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Workers during the Gilded Age toughed it out in scary conditions with no unions, no overtime, and no protection. It was 2 decades before women got the right to vote. Unions got the right to organize. Children were barred from working in factories and mines. Non-white immigrants weren't blocked from coming to America, and Black Americans got a new Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, and Supreme Court decisions ensuring their right to vote, to go to the theater or eat in a restaurant free from segregation and abuse, or to attend majority white schools. In other words, in the McKinley era, America was pretty much only great for men like Donald Trump. Tomorrow in New York City, Trump's 1890s vision of American greatness and Kamala Harris's call to move the country forward toward an opportunity economy will be on display in the form of a debate between their running mates, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. And the two men couldn't be more different. Like Bill McKinley, Vance was in the military, though as a communications guy, not a fighter. And his Mark Hanna, who bankrolled his career, is billionaire Peter Thiel. The Trump campaign is backed by other quirky billionaires, including Elon Musk, who's effectively running their ground game. And of course, Trump is running on a vow to implement McKinley-style massive tariffs and to return us to the Gilded Age with another round of extravagant tax cuts for billionaires like Musk and Thiel. While Tim Walz, a former football coach and 24-year military man, and Kamala Harris are running a kind of bread and butter fairness for the little guy, hold the super rich and corporations to account campaign that ironically would make that damn Teddy Roosevelt proud. But to win, they'll have to convince a majority of Americans that they do not want to go back to Trump and they do not want to live in a McKinley-style America. And here to discuss how they might do that and to preview tomorrow night's debate is Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Senator Klobuchar, it is great to be here.
Great
now
to
that
be
I'm
on, Joy.
Thank you. Now that I'm extracted from my history wormhole, I think it's interesting when Donald Trump makes a reveal. Because it's obvious that somebody told him who William McKinley is, because I highly doubt he knew who William McKinley was. But it's interesting that he's so attracted to a Gilded Age Republican. Your thoughts?
Oh, exactly. I was listening to your great opening there and thinking, like, only Donald Trump would want to take us back to a time when we only had 45 states, by the way, Joy, when the Wright brothers were still on bicycles and women couldn't vote. I mean, that is like way back, just as they're trying to do when it comes to women's rights to make their own decisions about their health care. It's the exact same thing, right? I mean, literally, they're citing a law that was in place, the Comstock Act, before there was even a Yellowstone prequel. So way back zone with these guys. And what I love about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz is they have an economic plan for the future, leading with small businesses and entrepreneurs, focusing on things workers need like childcare and housing, refusing to put in place something that would amount, as Donald Trump's proposal would do, to a $4,000 national sales tax on every American family. Instead, they're looking at taking on the case, as you made the point here, for the people of this country. And the Gilded Age, maybe you know, I wrote a book called Antitrust. It was, in fact, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the first president, who actually took this on. And before that, it was a country of monopoly after monopoly after monopoly in a very difficult time for the workers.
And that is why you are the perfect guest for this segment, Senator. Yes, because you clearly know this era very well. And that book is perfectly appropriate.
Everyone wants to talk about antitrust the night before the vice presidential debate. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I do. I mean, I'm a nerd. I do. But I love that you point that out. People are literally calling what Trump is trying to initiate a tequila tax, because I don't think people fully understand a massive tariff like what McKinley had when we're not a manufacturing economy like he had then. And they had a recession then for 5 years.
Right.
What you're talking about is your imported tequila, your imported beer that comes from Mexico, your imported beer from Germany,
exactly. And
your TVs, your video game systems, all of it goes up by the percentage of that tax.
And to be clear, there's a place for tariffs, right? When you see steel dumping from China, and the Biden-Harris administration have been very strong on that and keeping those tariffs in place. I mean, there is a place for it. But he would have this be a global-wide national tariff that would amount to this tax, as opposed to using it when necessary with specific industries and specific countries.
Right. When you hear your crazy uncle talking about someone being crooked, mentally impaired, lying, stupid, what do you think?
I have the same reaction you have, Lawrence, and thank you so much for having me on tonight. It's like he's looking in a mirror every time he opens his mouth now. We've long known that Donald uses very frequently a defense mechanism known as projection, in which he takes things that he unconsciously knows about himself but can't bear and projects them onto other people. That has been happening with increasing frequency over the last, well, let's see, when did that happen? Yes, when Vice President Harris became his opponent for the presidency. It's really, really made him unravel in a way we haven't seen before. So clearly, it's not that she's getting under his skin because he couldn't figure out how to adjust to a new strategy and a new opponent. It's because she pushes his buttons in a way very few people ever have.
Did he drive you to it? Did your crazy uncle drive you to becoming a clinical psychologist? And I don't know why I haven't wondered about this before, but it hit me today. And I just thought, I think I might have to do that if I had an uncle who was that crazy.
Well, unfortunately, he wasn't the only one. I've said this before, but it bears repeating because I think well, hopefully it will make people think about the choices they make in their lives. Donald was one of 5 children. My grandparents had 5 children, and every single one of them, including Donald, is and was a destroyed human being. So as shocking as it may seem, Donald actually was not the worst person in my family. He's the worst one now because he has, unfortunately, power that continues to be bestowed on him by a bankrupt Republican Party and tens of millions of Americans. But, the whole family system was so broken from the very beginning.
Tonight, we've got new information about a key voting group. According to an NBC Telemundo survey, Kamala Harris leads Trump among Latino voters, but it is the narrowest margin for a Democratic candidate in many years. Well, you're in luck. Steve Kornacki breaks it down for us.
This is what the trend now looks like. I think it clearly is something, because look at this. In 2020, Joe Biden, this is from the exit polls, beat Donald Trump by 33 points among Latino voters. That was an improvement relative to 16 and 12 for the Republicans. But now look at it 4 years later. Look where that 14 fits in with all of the other recent elections here. So, yes, much tighter than we're used to seeing. And again, this is a group, Latino voters, fast growing. About 1 in 6 voters almost going to be Latino in this election. We see a gender gap. We talk about this all the time in general. We see it with Hispanic voters. This race is tied among men. Women, Harris with a 26-point advantage. We see an age gap. Under 50 years old, this race is almost dead even. Harris by just 3 points over Trump. Over 50 years old, that's where Harris is the heart of her support.
For more, let's bring in Dan Nathan, co-founder of Risk Reversal, CNBC contributor and host of the On the Tape podcast. And Steve Leisman is here, CNBC senior economics reporter. Steve, break this down for us. What does this survey show you when it comes to what's motivating Latino voters?
The economy. Harris leads in so many different aspects of this poll. She leads on character. She leads on who would be best to address the Latino community, concerns of the Latino community. She leads on the abortion issue, every other issue. The two that are the two most important issues to the Latino community, cost of living and the economy. Trump leads on those. He's +4 on the economy, +9 on inflation, as well as on border and immigration. And frankly, the Latino voter looks more like the average voter when it comes to securing the border.
Do those voters realize that his #1 plan, mass deportation, would blow up the economy?
I don't know that. I don't think they do. And in fact, it's really hard to look at the Trump plan and see something that would reduce inflation. If you think about his tariff plan, if you think about the deportation of many workers, that would almost certainly raise wages and cause a huge inflation spiral in the country.
Well, Donald Trump has a 13-point lead over Kamala Harris when it comes to securing the border. This is my question. It goes right to what Steve said. Mass deportation crushes the economy. His other plan is we need money for security to build the wall. The wall doesn't help the country. What we need is an efficient processing system, because if you want the economy to grow, then we have to actually not have the labor shortage. We do fill these jobs, and once those jobs are filled, those people will be contributing to the economy. Do Democrats need to make this point more clear? Because it's stunning that Donald Trump could poll so well on the economy that he's offering no inflation solve for, and the border that the wall doesn't actually solve the problem.
Yeah, this goes back, though. You remember the caravans, the migrants, that, this is something
they disappeared the day after the midterms.
That's right. And so when I think about this, I mean, Kamala Harris has actually made some distinctions between the policies of Joe Biden and what she is tacking more towards the center. They're going to have more aggressive sort of asylum policies and that sort of thing. And when I think about just the main point here is that security, I think what you just said, and I think she's going to have tougher regulation in that regard. At least that's what she's signaling. And, the thing about immigration and how it relates to the economy, we have this massive demographic issue. We're doing a lot better than a lot of other developed countries when you think about Germany and you think about China in particular.
Nobody thinks about Germany when they're renting an apartment.
No doubt. I mean, but like what you just read, all of those issues where Trump is beating her on the economy and, inflation and the like here, that's across every voting bloc, if you think about it. And when I think about the fact that Latinos, think about where they are in a lot of very reliable sort of democratic sort of countries or states. So I just don't think it's that important.
But they're the fastest group when it comes to entrepreneurship in this country. And so this idea that Donald Trump just throws out there, I'm going to slash all regulation, is enticing for them. And VP Harris and Democrats can talk about that in more detail.
I think that's really important. And I will point out, Vice President Harris is the first candidate to talk, a Democratic candidate to talk about small business. Think about the number of people who work at small businesses, who rely on it, who shop there, and you say, okay, Hillary Clinton almost never used the word entrepreneurship, never talked about the free market. It's something like the Democrats have felt like they've had trouble saying those words. And the fact that Harris is saying it, I think, is a good thing.
She is, but small business owners also panic when they hear about the care economy. And here's why. Because we want to be a more inclusive economy. We want to give people jobs with dignity, right? We want to pay people more who have hourly jobs. We want to offer them benefits. We want to offer them unemployment. But when we do that, the care economy costs money. And so we have to make choices as a country. So should Kamala Harris say, in order to be this more inclusive economy where our small businesses will thrive and individuals can support themselves, guess what? We're not going to have $5 meals at restaurants, and your pizza isn't going to cost you $18. It might cost $28, because the vortex that we're in every day is going, all the data shows that we have a great economy. But why doesn't Kamala Harris poll better? It's because stuff's expensive. But if we explain to the American people this trade-off, maybe that would start to solve for that issue.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is if you think about what the Republicans are offering, it's just, there's no safety net as that regard. I mean, when I think about what Fed Chair Powell just did and what he said 2 weeks weeks ago when they lowered interest rates, they want to support employment, right? And so today, when you think about what he just said, they're going to be very measured about how they lower interest rates. If they start to see a fall off in employment, and I guess, Steve, this is something you track very closely, then they're going to go out and they're going to lower interest rates again. And they've done a very nice job of threading the needle as it relates to tamping down inflation. If you think about this, and unemployment at 4.3% is at the lowest levels of what came up from 3.6%. It's really at 40-year lows if you think about that. So there's a lot of things that are going on in the economy that I think are pretty good. And I think the administration, when they talk about capitalism for the middle class, this is something that you don't hear Republicans talk about. They don't put the word capitalism in too many things. So when I think about how she's tacked towards the center, she's coming at a lot of policies that Trump, at least that some people find pretty attractive right now. And
but people keep saying things. My life cost less when Donald Trump was in office. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, yes, prices were lower, but they're not coming down if Donald Trump is the president again. And doesn't that argument have to, it's only going to get worse.
It's right. Prices are not going to come down. And I don't think there's any fix or explanation to the American public about inflation. I think all there is time. People have to get used to a new
it's greed
price level.
It's price gouging.
I've talked to many people about this issue. We cannot run a policy of bringing prices down, because that means if prices come down, your income comes down along with that. You do not want to have essentially deflation. The only cure for this is having a job, getting a raise, and potentially running a tight labor market so wages can rise along with productivity. I don't think there's an explanation to the American public. People are angry about this, and they say, who is at fault? And they say the Biden-Harris team. For better or worse, if you think about it, what they did is they spent a lot of money ahead in the middle of the pandemic, and they did it for a good reason. You could say we were looking at unemployment rates that might have equaled the Great Depression. We avoided that and had pretty decent economic growth over this time period. And we paid a price. We paid a price in inflation. We paid through the pandemic. And we paid a price, by the way, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, but by every measure, we have a strong economy. But in less than 1 hour, we could potentially have a major port strike. This could derail some of the progress we have seen in the economy. How bad do you think this could be? Could this be sort of the October surprise?
I don't think it's going to be right away, but I think over time it would be bad. They're talking about something like costing the American economy $4 billion a day. But these are related issues, what we're just talking about. There is catch-up to be had in workers' wages. And I look back, the union has not had a raise since 2018. They would like a 77% raise. The company's offering 50%. So there is going to be some meeting in the middle. How quickly, we don't know. It's potentially costly over time and reigniting or rekindling some of the supply shocks we had to the economy.
Well, yeah, and just add that to the trade war, the tariffs that we have. And you just, the one thing about the Biden administration, they've been a friend of labor. So the idea that they could try to fix this sometime soon, I think you just used the term October surprise. It could be a real headwind to just some of the progress, I think, that the administration has made towards the industry. And then you think about manufacturing, too. That's the one other area. These tariffs are not particularly good for that. So when you think about the issues of, listen, if we have a strike, they're going to lay people off, right? And you're going to start to see the unemployment rate go higher than what the Fed suggested, 4.4% by the end of the year. But that may cause further rate cuts in the near term.